The series introduces us to Eve, an analyst who works in the military intelligence section. During a work meeting, her supervisors bring up an assassination case involving an influential figure. Carolyn, one of the supervisors, points out that the only witness of the assassination is the girlfriend of the deceased. However, she's under protection to prevent another assassination attempt. As the supervisors round up to close the meeting, Eve intercepts to voice out her opinion on the case. She believes the assassin is a woman, but no one takes her theory seriously. While leaving, she tries to seek permission to interview the witness, but her colleague Bill advises her against it and instructs her only to protect the witness. Back at the office, Eve learns from a colleague that the witness hasn't been transferred to the protection area, so she decides to pay an unauthorized visit to the witness. While interviewing the witness on the identity of the assassin, she learns that the witness had been acting deranged after experiencing the murder. The witness continues to utter meaningless words in Polish, so Eve has no choice but to leave. But later that day, she visits her husband at his game club and plays the witness recording to a Polish player, who translates it as meaning small breast. With this, Eve deduces that the assassin is a killer. It turns out to be true. The assassin, Villanelle, receives news from her handler that the girlfriend of the dead target had witnessed the assassination and will be interrogated by the authorities. The handler instructs her to kill the witness to prevent her identity from being exposed. Meanwhile, Eve has a hard time convincing Bill that the assassin is a woman. To prove her point, she reveals that she had interviewed the witness, but Bill reminds her it's against her job ethics. However, Eve doesn't give up. That night, she takes her friend, who's a Polish speaker, to the hospital in order to interview the witness without authorization. As she leaves her friend in the lobby to use the restroom, she encounters Villanelle, dressed as a nurse, who stares at her weirdly before leaving the restroom. Confused at the unusual stare, Eve continues with her business in the toilet. But as soon as she comes out of the toilet, she sees a dead body in the lobby. It turns out the witness and nurses around had also been killed by the assassin. After this incident, her supervisors accuse her of conducting an illegal investigation and fire both her and Bill. But that night, Carolyn, a military intelligence officer, visits Eve. As they take a walk, she reveals that the female assassin has been untraceable for years and needs to be arrested. She invites Eve for breakfast at a restaurant to discuss more on it. In the following days, as Villanelle commits another assassination, Eve meets up with Carolyn and reveals her suspicion that the high-profile assassination had all been committed by a woman. So, Carolyn takes her to a secret office building where she reveals all the investigations, evidence, and leads. They had gotten to trace the female assassin, but every piece of evidence has led to a dead end. Carolyn reveals she had been impressed by Eve and offers to hire her to continue the investigation on the assassin. Kenny, Carolyn's son, walks in on their conversation, so Carolyn introduces him to Eve and tells her he'll be joining her team. So she'll have to recruit 2 more people to join in the investigation. Meanwhile, Villanelle's handler shows up at her house unannounced and criticizes her for killing the nurses when her only assignment was to kill the witness. He prevents her from taking another target until she's assessed and deemed fit to carry on her job. She reluctantly agrees to this. During the therapy session with the psychologist, she acts normal and answers every question correctly, making the psychologist deem her as fit. But the handler passes a paper to the psychologist, and when he shows it to her, she begins to act anxious and reveals that the drawing looks more like her mother and nothing like Anna. Seeing her reaction, the psychologist refuses to sign her off. After the therapy session, Villanelle yells at her handler for setting her up, but he advises her to take a break and explore the city. She pretends to be fine with this arrangement and reaches out for a hug. As he returns the hug, she steals a card containing the details of her next target from his coat pocket. Meanwhile, Eve recruits her former work colleagues, Bill and Elena, to join her in uncovering the identity of the female assassins. After briefing them on all the evidence collected, she takes a break to use the restroom. While looking at herself in the mirror, she suddenly remembers her encounter with the nurse at the hospital, who stared weirdly at her. Not knowing that the nurse is actually Villanelle, Eve rushes over to her colleague to tell them that she believes a nurse at the hospital had murdered the witness. She assigns different tasks to both Kenny and Elena in order to track down the assassin. Meanwhile, Villanelle goes against her handler's wish and kills her next target. So, he shows up at her house and instructs her to pipe things down since the intelligence service had recruited Eve to track her down. Upon learning about Eve, Villanelle enters her name into the internet to get a photo of her. As soon as she discovers that Eve may have seen her face at the hospital, she immediately panics. True to her fears, Eve ends up describing her face to an artist for sketching, but she's unable to describe some features due to not taking a serious look at the assassin. A few days later, Villanelle commits another assassination in Berlin by pretending to be a nurse at a massage center to kill a Chinese colonel. Eve learns of the assassination and also discovers that Villanelle had used her name to register as the nurse at the massage center. This makes her realize that Villanelle is aware of her identity, so later that day, she begs Bill to go with her to Berlin to track down Villanelle. As soon as she arrives in Berlin with Bill, Villanelle begins to stalk her and even steals her suitcase to search through it. As Eve goes shopping for new clothes, Villanelle stalks her to the boutique and continues to watch her every movement with obsession. That night, as Eve video calls her house, Villanelle eavesdrops on their conversation through a listening device. It turns out she had planted an audio bug in the dress that Eve bought from the boutique. As she eavesdrops on the conversation, she hears Eve mentioning Bill's name and gets interested in Bill. That night, Eve dresses up to meet a Chinese ambassador to get more intel on the assassination, so Bill decides to escort her to the train station. After he leaves her to wait for the train, he suddenly notices Villanelle watching Eve with intensity. He becomes suspicious of her actions, so he approaches and stops her from entering the train without knowing she's the assassin. Although she walks away from him, he continues to stalk her into the streets. As he closely follows her, he gives a call to Eve to tell her that he might have uncovered the assassin's identity, but she ignores his calls to focus on extracting intel from the ambassador. Seeing this, Bill sends a voicemail to her and returns to follow Villanelle into a bar. At the same time, the Chinese ambassador gives Eve a flash drive containing some intel, so she quickly leaves to meet Bill at the bar. But as she rushes over to find Bill at the bar, Villanelle sees him first and stabs him multiple times without being noticed. When the handler learns about the murder, he criticizes Villanelle for killing a non-target and decides to punish her by assigning 2 operatives to work together with her. But as soon as she meets Nadia, one of the operatives, they immediately get into a fight, so Diego, the second operative, has to stop them. A few minutes later, they put aside their differences in order to carry out their mission successfully. Meanwhile, Eve's husband informs her that her stolen suitcase has been returned to their address. As she opens the suitcase, she finds tons of expensive designer clothes and a card that says, "Sorry, baby." She immediately realizes Villanelle had sent them, so the next day she informs her colleagues about it, and they worry that Villanelle knows her home's address. Now scared, Eve instructs Kenny and Elena to carry on with their investigation. As soon as they get to the office, Kenny looks through the flash drive given by the Chinese ambassador and discovers that about 3 bank transfers were often made to a prep private school in Sussex for school fees payment. Eve immediately connects the dots and rushes over to Carolyn to reveal that there was a time when her former boss at the intelligence service had drunkenly revealed that he was having a hard time paying his kids' private school fees. So she suspects he's a mole working for the organization that sponsors the assassin. Carolyn advises her to keep her findings a secret until they find substantial evidence, so Eve plans with Elena to patrol the area where her former boss lives to get evidence. Meanwhile, Villanelle and the 2 operatives receive a picture of their target, which turns out to be Eve's former boss. As they wait around his house to get a chance to kill him, he gets wind of their plan and escapes in a car. So they begin to chase after him. At the same time, Kenny notices through the satellite that Frank is being chased, so he informs Eve and Elena to go to his rescue. The former boss manages to drive a distance from the assassins, so Eve calls and instructs him on how to step away from his car and hide in the bushes. The assassins find his car and open fire at it, thinking he's inside. But after this, an argument ensues between them, so Villanelle manipulates Nadia into killing Diego. With Diego dead, Villanelle runs over Nadia with a car and focuses on pursuing the former boss to kill him, but he manages to escape and get into Eve's car. Once they get to a safe place, the former boss reveals that he knows nothing about Villanelle. However, he gives them Nadia's name, so Eve immediately instructs Kenny to conduct a research on Nadia. Later that day, they take the boss to a safe house. After stabilizing his anxiety, he reveals that the assassins work for a mysterious organization named the 12, and that this organization offered to pay for his wife's cancer treatment if he provided all the information about military intelligence. That day, as Eve returns to the office, Kenny tells her he has found some information about Nadia from a prison record which states she had died 4 years ago, which was impossible. That night, Eve returns home and gets an impulse to try out the expensive dresses that Villanelle had way-billed to her. Seeing how fitting it looks, she grabs a wine bottle and begins to study Nadia's case file. But then, she hears the doorbell and goes to check it out, only to discover that Villanelle has infiltrated the house. Eve immediately tries to escape, but Villanelle catches up to her and uses the tap on the bathtub to stop Eve from screaming. She tells Eve to make her dinner, so Eve nervously makes dinner, and as they sit for a discussion, Villanelle hints that the military intelligence aren't saints, and that they both may be working for the same group. Eve gets angry and tries to stab her, but Villanelle pins her to the wall and requests her phone's passcode before leaving. Eve immediately goes to notify Carolyn about the situation, while Villanelle uses the information on the phone to track the former boss and kill him before the rescue team arrives. The next day, as she makes breakfast for herself, her handler informs her that Nadia, whom she ran over with a car, had survived and is at a prison in Russia. A few days later, they both arrive in Russia, and the handler uses his connections to put Villanelle in prison in order to get her to kill Nadia. At the same time, Eve and her crew learn that Nadia had survived and was in a prison in Russia, so they plan to travel to Russia with the intention of interviewing her to get the truth about the Secret 12 organization. Before leaving, Eve goes to visit her husband, who is angry that she's putting her life in danger to catch an assassin. This leads to arguments between them that end up in a fight. Later that day, Eve and Carolyn arrive in Russia and meet up with a Russian intelligence officer who introduces them to Konstantin, who also happens to be Villanelle's handler. Not knowing this, Carolyn asks them for help to speak to Nadia in prison, and after going back and forth with each other, they agree to allow her to interview Nadia face-to-face in prison. The next day, as they arrive in the prison, the handler excuses himself to give them space to interview Nadia. So, as soon as they meet Nadia, they promise to have her released from prison and transferred to the UK embassy if she provides the details they want. Seeing Nadia hesitate, Eve switches up the question and asks for information about Villanelle. So Nadia reveals that she had helped Villanelle escape from prison years ago but got nothing in return. As she's about to reveal details that can get Villanelle caught, the handler suddenly walks into the interrogation and gestures for her to stay silent. So, she changes her mind and reveals that Villanelle has someone who's her weakness called Anna. Meanwhile, Villanelle is beaten up by an inmate, so she's sent to the doctor's office. The doctor, who's secretly working for her handler, gives her a dagger and tells her the room where Nadia stays. So, later that day, Villanelle starts chaos in the prison and uses the opportunity to find Nadia. Seeing that her life is in danger, Nadia immediately writes a letter addressed to Eve and slips it under the door before Villanelle kills her. The security guards arrive at the prison room to find a bloody scene, so they put Villanelle in seclusion. There, she learns from an officer that her handler has no plan of helping her escape prison. The next day, Eve and Carolyn learn of Nadia's death from the handler. As they privately discuss their next plan, Eve suspects that Villanelle must have been responsible for the death. But Carolyn dismisses this as impossible, so Eve insists that they look into Anna, the person that Nadia told them about. From their research, it turns out that Villanelle had killed Anna's husband by castration and was sent to prison for it. Upon hearing this, Carolyn suddenly changes her mind and reveals she's no longer interested in finding and capturing Villanelle. She instructs Eve to return to London and focus on other investigations, but Eve disobeys this order and continues working with Kenny to find more information on the organization sponsoring the assassin. To get started, she goes to find Anna, who works as an English teacher at the university. She begs for any information about Villanelle, so the woman invites her over to the house to take a look at some of the letters that Villanelle had written as a student. Meanwhile, Villanelle is put in a solitary room with a dangerous inmate. The two get into a fight that ends with Villanelle killing her. So, as she's transferred to a different prison, a shootout ensues, and a mysterious man rescues and takes her to meet her new handler. The new handler gives her an assignment to kill her former handler, but instead, she kills him, and looks through his computers to discover that the organization had set Constantine as the target for assassination. Meanwhile, Eve looks through Villanelle's letters and discovers that Villanelle had fallen in love with her English teacher. But since the teacher was married, she killed the husband in order to get closer to the teacher. After learning this, Eve advises Anna, the teacher, to stay safe since Villanelle had been running rampant. As Eve stands up to leave, Anna gives her a package she had once received from Villanelle. Eve opens it to find an expensive coat, and as she fiddles with it, she discovers something hidden in the pocket area. So she immediately tears it open and finds Villanelle's passports. She quickly steals it and acts normal when Anna returns to the room. Meanwhile, Villanelle meets up with Constantine at his house and reveals she has been given a mission to kill him. She forces him to overdose on his pills, but he hits her with a log and escapes. On the other hand, Eve and Kenny review CCTV footage of the day Nadia was killed in prison, but they end up finding footage of Villanelle entering a visitor's room. As they continue watching, they discover that Villanelle had met up with Carolyn on the day that Nadia was killed. Upon discovering this, Eve and Kenny go to confront Carolyn, but they're shocked to find Constantine in Carolyn's hotel room. It turns out that Constantine is seeking their help to save his daughter, whom Villanelle is holding hostage. Eve suggests that they check up on Anna since there's a high chance that Villanelle will show up there, so they all set out to Anna's house. True to her words, Villanelle goes over to Anna's house and uses Constantine's daughter as a distraction, while she sneaks into Anna's room to search for her passport in the coat pocket. However, she finds a note that Eve had placed there, and before she can make sense of the situation, Anna finds her in the room and offers to clean up her face wounds. But as she goes to get the first aid kit from the drawer, she suddenly pulls out a gun and threatens to shoot Villanelle. But she eventually changes her mind and kills herself. Meanwhile, Kenny discovers prison CCTV footage showing when a guard had picked up the last letter that Nadia wrote before she was killed. That same day, Villanelle arranges a meeting with both Eve and Constantine at a cafe. When they meet, she requests for her passport in exchange for Constantine's daughter. Eve complies and gives out the passport, so Villanelle shoots Constantine before escaping. Due to this, Carolyn fires Eve and stops her from continuing the investigation, so Eve changes her mind about returning to London. Instead, she travels to Paris and tracks down Villanelle's apartment. Then, she gets the keys to the apartment room from an old neighbor. As soon as she enters the room, she begins to scatter the wardrobe clothes and break bottles in anger. But in the middle of this, Villanelle returns, so she quickly grabs a dagger and a gun to arm herself. She points the gun at Villanelle and threatens to shoot, but Villanelle is unfazed. So, they decide to sit for a discussion to confess their love for each other. Eve confesses to being obsessed with her, while Villanelle also confesses to having wild dreams about her. After this discussion, Eve drops her guard and lies down on the bed, so Villanelle takes the gun and also lies on the bed. As the tension grows between the two, Eve suddenly pulls out her hidden dagger to stab Villanelle in the stomach. But she immediately panics and goes to get a towel to stop the bleeding. When she returns, Villanelle has escaped, so she immediately escapes from the apartment and gets on a plane to London. Meanwhile, Villanelle endures the pain and manages to get into a taxi. She's dropped at the entrance of the hospital, where she receives treatment and regains unconsciousness. She lies to the doctor that her husband is an abuser who works as a detective, so the doctor agrees to remove her information from the hospital's record. Later that day, she bonds with a patient at the hospital, and when he asks about her stab wounds, she claims that Eve had stabbed her to show the intensity of her love. Meanwhile, Eve arrives in London and throws a small celebration, thinking Villanelle is dead. While cutting the carrots to make dinner for her husband, she suddenly becomes infatuated with the knife, but acts normal once her husband returns. At the same time, Villanelle convinces her newfound hospital friend to steal a doctor's uniform. And with this, she manages to sneak into the hospital storage room to steal some drugs. She also pretends to be a doctor to steal from a woman's pocket. but she discovers that the money won't be enough. As she contemplates her next course of action, she suddenly faints. However, she regains consciousness the next day, changes into a new dress, and kills her newfound friend before escaping from the hospital. Meanwhile, Eve meets up with Carolyn, who hires her again to investigate a new series of assassinations. Carolyn takes her to the morgue and shows her the dead body of a man named Alistair Peel. It turns out that the letter Nadia slipped under the prison cell contained the name Alistair Peel. Confused about why Nadia would write the name, Carolyn decides to hire Eve again to investigate. According to the morgue attendant, Alistair Peel had died from cardiac arrest, but since Nadia had written his name on the note, it meant there was more to his death. So, Carolyn introduces Eve to a new team of investigators, which includes Hugo and Kenny. Eve gives them a briefing on the string of assassinations committed by Villanelle. Later that night, as Eve searches the internet for any news on the injured Villanelle, she stumbles on a news report about a patient who was murdered at the hospital. As she looks through pictures from the crime scene, she discovers that the boy was holding on to a half-eaten apple after his murder. With this, Eve deduces that Villanelle was trying to send a message to her through the biblical symbolism of an apple. Upon discovering this, Eve begins to panic at the possibility that Villanelle is still alive. The next day, as she looks over the photos from the murder of Alistair Peel, she discovers that Villanelle wasn't the assassin and that the person behind this murder carried out their tasks discreetly, unlike Villanelle. After coming to this conclusion, Eve names the new assassin the Ghost, since she's very meticulous and discreet in her assassinations. Later that day, Carolyn invites her over to the house to show her that Constantine was actually alive and didn't die from Villanelle's gunshots. Meanwhile, Villanelle continues to carry out assassinations under a new handler named Raymond. He tells her to be discreet in her murders and also informs her that a new female assassin has been employed to compete with her. On the other hand, Eve is paranoid that Villanelle is still alive. So she secretly meets up with Constantine and strikes a deal with him. She promises to help him find his daughter, who's under witness protection, but in exchange, he'll have to find out Villanelle's whereabouts. He immediately agrees to this and uses his connections to locate Villanelle in her hotel room. She's happy to find out he didn't die from her gunfire, so as they sit down for a discussion, she tells him that her new handler is Raymond. He's shocked to hear this and reveals that Raymond is usually assigned to assassins that the organization no longer needs, which means that the organization are planning to dispose of and replace her with someone else. He advises her to stop working for the organization and become a freelance assassin, with him becoming her partner. She agrees to this, so they escape the hotel together. Meanwhile, Carolyn finds out about Eve's secret meeting with Constantine, so she orders Eve to forget about Villanelle and focus on finding out the identity of the new female assassin. So, Eve focuses on this, which leads her to discover that before the death of Alistair Peel, which was disguised as cardiac arrest, there had been tons of other deaths involving people he worked with. But these deaths weren't suspicious since most of them were dismissed as deaths from allergies, shock, and other health issues. After noticing these patterns, Eve immediately notifies her colleague that people related to Alistair Peel must be kept safe since their life was in danger. So, the next day, they visit the dead Alistair Peel's company to meet his son Aaron. When Eve inquires about the company's sales, Aaron refuses to answer and calls in a lawyer in response to their questions. Seeing this, Eve warns him that his father's ex-girlfriend and manager had all died suspiciously, but he ignores the warning and somehow hints that he's maybe behind the deaths around his father's trusted people. Later that day, as Eve and her colleague contemplate Aaron's involvement in the recent assassins, they learn that Alistair Peel's secretary has been murdered. As they go to investigate the scene, Eve points out that the new assassin often does a clean job without spilling blood, which is a sharp contrast to Villanelle. Meanwhile, Villanelle grows bored of working as a freelance assassin, so she visits an art gallery and becomes interested in art where people's stomachs are cut open. So later that day, while carrying out an assassination mission, she cuts open the target's stomach in an attempt to grab Eve's attention to the case. However, Carolyn gets news of this case and assigns another investigator to the case. Eve tries to pitch herself for the job since she suspects Villanelle is behind the assassination, but Carolyn refuses to let her work on it. Instead, she urged Eve to focus on uncovering the identity of the new assassin in town. Left with no choice, Eve looks through all the murders committed by the new assassin and realizes that all the targets had died from induced health issues, which means that the assassin is familiar with drugs and must have been a nurse or doctor. With this discovery, she orders Kenny to browse their database for assassins who have worked in the medical field. After spending hours searching all the databases, they discover the identity of the female assassin. The next day, Eve goes to find her and invites her for a discussion. While interrogating the new assassin, she refuses to reveal any details about the organization she works for. But when she's asked about Villanelle, she shows signs of fear and reveals that Villanelle now works as a freelance assassin. Eve becomes excited about this and tells her colleague that the only way they can get the female assassin to reveal important information is if they hire Villanelle to extract the information for them. Since Villanelle no longer works with the organization, Eve suggests that they put a hit on herself and hire Villanelle as the assassin to take her out. Although her team disagrees with this, Eve insists it's the only way to lure Villanelle. So later that day, Constantine gives Villanelle a photo of her next target. When she sees it's a picture of Eve, she gets angry and refuses to take on the job. But Constantine convinces her to get rid of Eve since the woman is becoming her weakness. After thinking over this for a while, Villanelle decides to carry out the job, so she goes with Constantine to meet a gun dealer. Meanwhile, Eve looks forward to being killed by Villanelle, so with the assistance of her work colleague, she arms herself with a bulletproof vest. But as soon as she gets home, the doorbell rings, so she removes the bulletproof and goes to answer it, only to find Villanelle waiting outside. She invites her in, and as they begin to chat, Eve reveals that she had placed a hit on herself to lure her out. But Villanelle doesn't buy this. Instead, she forces Eve to take some poisonous pills that would silently kill her. After Eve tearfully takes the pills, Villanelle acts shocked at her obedience and yells at her to vomit it out. As Eve runs over to the sink to throw up, Villanelle begins to laugh and confesses that the pills aren't dangerous. After this, she agrees to work for Eve, so Eve takes her to meet the female assassin for questioning. After a private time with the assassin, Villanelle walks out and reveals that the death of Alistair Peels had been ordered by his own son, Aaron. It turns out that Aaron is secretly selling weapons to the 12 organization, so he ordered the female assassin to kill his father in order to remove obstacles from his path. The next day, Villanelle meets up with Eve's husband and tells him that she had been stabbed by Eve. She also hints that she's in a romantic relationship with Eve. Upon hearing this, he rushes over to confront Eve about it, which leads him to discover that she may have a fetish for rough love. They eventually make out that night, but the next morning, he confesses that he doesn't like the new direction of their relationship and leaves. Meanwhile, Eve and Carolyn are bent on finding evidence that points to Aaron as the mastermind behind the recent assassinations. They discover that he doesn't let anyone close to him except his sister, so Eve decides that the only way they can get close to Aaron is through his sister. After brainstorming with her teammates on how to achieve this, Eve suggests that they hire Villanelle for the task. So she meets up with Villanelle, who immediately agrees to change her identity and go undercover as a New Yorker named Billy in order to befriend Aaron's sister. Eve assists her from the side by instructing a coworker to forge a social media presence for Villanelle. Before starting the undercover operation, Carolyn instructs everyone not to keep in contact with Villanelle during the undercover role since Aaron is easily suspicious of the people around his sister. So, later that day, Villanelle joins a support group that Aaron's sister attends and grabs the girl's attention when narrating her tragic life story. After the event, Amber, Aaron's sister, approaches her for a quick chat before leaving. The next day, after the group's meeting, Amber tries to invite Villanelle to her house, but the guard interrupts their conversation. Villanelle becomes annoyed at this and approaches the guard for a discussion. When no one's looking, she pushes the guard into the road, leading her to get crushed by a bus. A few days after the tragic incident, Villanelle receives a text from Amber inviting her for dinner at the family house. So that night, she honors the invitation and eats dinner together with Aaron and his sister. As they sit together to play a game, Aaron begins to question her identity and utters tons of insulting words in the process. so she hits him with a book, causing him to bleed. But the next day, he delivers a note to her doorstep asking for forgiveness and inviting her over for lunch. So Eve shows up at her house and instructs her to convince Aaron to take her to Rome, where a business meeting with influential people will be taking place. Villanelle attends the lunch date and charms Aaron with her unusual personality, so he invites her to join him on his trip to Rome. Meanwhile, Carolyn meets up with Constantine and Eve to plan their next course of action. Carolyn tells Eve that all Villanelle has to do is to join Aaron in the Rome business meeting in order to get intel on what Aaron is selling and to whom he's selling. She also specifies that the safe word to use when in danger is gentleman. After some days, Villanelle arrives in Rome on Aaron's invitation, while Eve and a colleague book a hotel next to the building where the business meeting is being held. So, as Aaron takes Villanelle to all his business meetings, Eve and the colleague eavesdrop on their conversation through a listening device and discover that Aaron sells top secret information to higher-ups, making people believe that he sells weapons. Back in London, Eve's husband regains consciousness and finds himself in a warehouse with his co-worker's body staring at him. It turns out that Villanelle had locked him in a storage room and killed the woman he was having a fling with. Back in Rome, as Villanelle eats breakfast with Aaron, she becomes curious about his job and requests to see a photo of his business partners. So he turns over his laptop, and she's shocked to learn that he works with Raymond, her former handler. Seeing this, she comments that he looks like a gentleman. Eve, while eavesdropping through the listening device, hears the safe word gentleman and immediately realizes that Villanelle needs help. As she goes to inform her colleague, she discovers that an assassin had broken into the hotel to assassinate them, so she quickly hides under the bed to avoid being seen. After the assassin leaves, she rushes over to save her injured colleague. Later that day, she dresses up as a cleaner to infiltrate the hotel in an attempt to save Villanelle. But as she enters the room, she's shocked to see Villanelle laughing together with Aaron. As if expecting her arrival, Aaron instructs Villanelle to kill Eve and promises to give her everything. So Villanelle picks up a knife and stands up to approach Eve, but then she suddenly slits Aaron's throat. Eve is shocked at the sudden turn of events and becomes worried that things have escalated, but Villanelle assures her that everything will be fine. So Eve returns to her hotel room to get her belongings, while Villanelle goes to meet up with Constantine to get a car they can use for escape. Later, as she goes to the hotel to meet Eve, she comes across Raymond waiting for her in the hallway with an axe. The two get into a fight, with Raymond overpowering and almost killing her. Fortunately, Eve shows up and kills Raymond with the axe. As they escape from the hotel into the streets, Villanelle takes her through a shortcut to safety. However, they get into an argument when Eve discovers that Villanelle had allowed Raymond to overpower her in order to force Eve into killing him. Eve is angry about being set up, so she refuses to run away with Villanelle and insists on returning to her job. As she turns to leave, Villanelle suddenly shoots her and abandons her to die in the lonely area. 6 months later, Villanelle tries to get married to a woman, but Dasha, a former assassin trainer, shows up at the ceremony, causing it to end in chaos. So she leaves abruptly with Dasha. After a while, Dasha tries to convince her to return to work as an assassin for the 12 organizations, so Villanelle requests to be promoted to the position of a keeper, a role which is higher than being a handler. After thinking over it, Dasha agrees on the condition that she assassinates a local politician in Barcelona. Meanwhile, Eve survives the gunshot and begins to work as a chef at a Korean restaurant. Kenny quits working for the military intelligence and now works as a journalist privately investigating the corrupt actions of the 12. Eve, now divorced, lives alone in a small apartment. One night, Kenny suddenly visits to catch up on old times with her. He tells her about his private investigations, and she also reveals that she no longer wants to return to her former career. Upon hearing this, he begins to tell her about his recent investigations that led to a breakthrough in his discovering the truth. But she stops him from talking and insists that she's no longer interested in exposing the 12 organizations, so he leaves. The next day, Eve goes to visit her husband, who now resides at a mental health facility, after the trauma he experienced when Villanelle murdered his co-worker in front of him. After checking up on him, Eve goes to work but gets annoyed with her coworkers, so she steps out to give a call to Kenny, who's still investigating the evil organization. She asks him out for a drink, so they agree to meet that evening. As soon as the call ends, Kenny continues with his investigations but stops halfway when he hears a mysterious noise outside. Meanwhile, after work, Eve goes to Kenny's office to pick him up but finds the office empty. As she looks around, she suddenly hears a loud thud outside and goes to check it out, only to discover that Kenny had been pushed off the building, leading to his death. At his funeral, everyone talks about how his fall from the rooftop had been intentional, but this annoys Eve, who thinks otherwise, so she angrily leaves despite Carolyn's efforts to talk to her. The next day, Carolyn shows up for work at the military intelligence, but her colleague stops her from participating in a meeting and later advises her to take a leave to mourn for her son, Kenny. So later that day, she goes to visit Eve and begs her to investigate the person who pushed Kenny to his death privately. Eve refuses to take on the task, so Carolyn shows her a recent murder that Villanelle had committed. This triggers Eve. Later that night, as Eve drinks in a bar and contemplates the matter, she pulls out Kenny's phone and tries to unlock it, but suddenly receives a call from Kenny's boss, who tells her to return the phone to their office. She immediately shows up at the office but refuses to hand over the phone, so they strike a deal, promising to give her password to the phone in exchange for her cooperation in investigating Kenny's death. After unlocking his phone, they begin to look into his computer files to dig into the last case he was investigating before his death. Afterwards, Eve goes to meet Carolyn to tell her about the case and how it could be the reason behind Kenny's death. Unknown to them, Constantine is eavesdropping on their conversation through a disguised listening device he had placed in the house. After a few days, he goes to find Villanelle and tells her that Eve is still alive and didn't die from the gunshot. Villanelle is shocked to hear this and experiences a breakdown. Meanwhile, Carolyn gathers Eve, Kenny's boss, and a new investigator to look into the details surrounding Kenny's death. So, Eve shows up at Kenny's office to study the last files he was investigating. A coworker at the office points out that the files were all financial records belonging to different people in different locations. After unraveling the code to get access to the file details, it leads them to discover Kenny had been looking into the financial records of a Chinese ambassador who Villanelle had assassinated. Although the ambassador was dead, his account had become active and was used to make transfers to an unknown account in Geneva. So, Eve decides to trace the account. To help her with this, Carolyn meets up with an old friend who works as a Swiss banker and manages to convince him to give her details about the unknown account. The next day, she shares this information with Eve. It turns out that the owner of the secret account is Charles, a former Russian agent who was reported to have died during the Cold War. But in reality, he's still alive, so Eve suspects he's the chief accountant working for the 12 organizations. Later that day, as Eve goes to visit her husband at the mental health facility, she's shocked to learn that he has discharged himself and has traveled to Poland to have private time with himself. So, that day, as Eve sends him a text while on a bus, she looks up and suddenly sees Villanelle walking up to her. Annoyed, she rushes up to a fight, but Villanelle easily overpowers her, so Eve kisses her before headbutting her. As she recovers from the pain, Villanelle uses the opportunity to escape from the bus. Meanwhile, Carolyn goes to pick up Charles, the secret accountant, for questioning, but as they drive away, a patrol police signals for them to stop. Unknown to them, this is Villanelle disguised as a patrol policeman. Villanelle walks up to them and suddenly shoots the accountant before leaving. That night, as Eve returns to her small apartment, she finds a stuffed toy with a recorded message from Villanelle. Meanwhile, Nico, Eve's husband, arrives in Poland and begins to live a simple life while ignoring Eve's text messages pleading for them to get back together. But after a while, he responds to the texts, causing Eve to fly over to Poland to reconcile with him. At the same time, Constantine visits the late accountant's wife and convinces her to send an important financial file to him in exchange for her safety. Next, he meets up with Villanelle and orders her to kill the accountant's wife secretly. The next day, Dasha visits Villanelle's home and somehow piece together that Villanelle had met up with Eve. She tries to advise her to get over the obsession with Eve, but Villanelle ignores this advice and goes ahead to disguise herself as a gardener to kill the accountant's wife. Meanwhile, Dasha is visited by an agent from the organization who orders her to keep Villanelle under control. So, to sort this out, she travels to Poland pretending to be a helpless native to lure Eve's husband into helping her at the farmhouse. It turns out that she had also stolen the man's phone, using it to text and lure Eve into traveling to Poland. As soon as Eve arrives to find her husband, Dasha quickly picks up a sharp rake and hides behind a wooden door. So, as Eve approaches her husband, Dasha uses the rake to stab into his neck without being seen. Seeing this, Eve breaks down in shock. Meanwhile, Villanelle decides to go back to her hometown and family to spend some time with them. There, she bonds with her elder brother and little half-brother. After spending some happy days with them, her mother meets her alone in the kitchen and tells her to leave the next day. When Villanelle refuses to comply, the mother claims she has some form of darkness around her and tells her to leave before the darkness spreads to the extended family. Upon hearing this, Villanelle gets angry and kills her mother. Afterwards, she pours fuel around the entire house and sets it ablaze, killing everyone in the house except her elder and little half-brother. Then, she angrily leaves and cries by herself on a train. Meanwhile, Eve's husband survives the next stab, and when she visits him at the hospital to console him, he types a keyboard, telling her to leave him forever. Villanelle, on the other hand, meets up with a higher-up who works at the 12 organization. The woman promotes her to the role of a keeper and gives her the task of assassinating a politician. Seeing that her new position isn't any different from the former, Villanelle becomes angry and contemplates leaving the organization forever. As Eve investigates the person behind the stabbing of her husband, it leads her to uncover the identity of Dasha. So she goes to Carolyn to gather more information on Dasha. Carolyn tells her to be careful of Dasha since she was one of the top assassins in the 90s. Meanwhile, Villanelle meets up with Constantine and tells him that she wants to abandon the life of an assassin. She begs to join him in eloping from the 12 organization. He rejects her request and reveals he can't elope with her since it'll grab the attention of the organization. So, he decides to make separate travel plans for her as soon as he successfully elopes with his daughter. As they discuss this, the daughter catches them together and yells at her father for still hanging out with Villanelle even when she tried to kill him. After the daughter angrily leaves, Constantine tells Villanelle to act normal during the days leading to their elopement in order to prevent any suspicion from the organization. That day, as she returns home, he finds an officer from the military intelligence in his room. The man assigns him to find out the person who gave the orders to kill the accountant's wife. But this is a hard job for Constantine, since it was him who gave out the order to Villanelle. Meanwhile, Eve finds Dasha and engages her in a conversation about Villanelle, so Dasha admits that she had trained Villanelle to become a top assassin. She also advises Eve to give up on trying to expose the organization. In the meantime, Constantine prepares his luggage and calls his daughter, telling her to prepare for their elopement. At the same time, Villanelle assassinates the politician to avoid suspicion of the organization. But during the operation, she gets stabbed in the arm by the dying politician. When she gets home, she breaks down in tears and confesses to Dasha that she's tired of the assassin world and wants to leave. That night, as Constantine goes to pick up his daughter at his divorced wife's house, he's horrified to witness his daughter running over a man with a devilish smile on her face. This makes him realize that Villanelle had been a bad influence on the girl. Meanwhile, Villanelle is questioned by a higher-up on her commitments to the organization, so, to avoid suspicion, she requests another assassination job. The higher-up fulfills her request, but orders her to carry out the job with Dasha to prevent mistakes like the last. As for Constantine, his daughter is detained by the authorities for manslaughter, impeding his elopement plan. He tries to bribe an officer into releasing her, but the man refuses the offer and insists that his daughter is a psychopath. Constantine begins to yell, but stops when he experiences a mini heart attack. Seeing this, the officer walks away, insisting on detaining the girl. Meanwhile, Eve decides to interview Villanelle to get a breakthrough on who murdered Kenny. So, with the help of a coworker, she reviews Villanelle's credit card history to pinpoint her location. The history shows that Villanelle is in Scotland, so Eve makes a trip to the place. And, true to the investigation, Villanelle is in Scotland with Dasha to carry out an assassination task. While on the way to their hotel room, the both of them get into an argument. with Dasha mocking Villanelle for being lonely all her life. The next day, they pretend to play golf in a resort in order to get closer to their target. At the same time, Eve arrives in Scotland and makes a trip to the golf resort. Meanwhile, Villanelle and Dasha lure their target into the forest to help them search for a golf ball. As he becomes distracted while looking for it, Villanelle raises her golf club to hit him, but suddenly changes her mind and hits Dasha instead. Then, she tells the man to run while Dasha bleeds alone in the forest. As Eve drives through the forest in a taxi, she stumbles on the target who was almost killed. He describes Villanelle's appearance and exact location, so Eve goes in search of Villanelle. Meanwhile, Villanelle meets up with Constantine in the forest, and they drive away from the place. As Eve searches around the forest, she finds a bleeding Dasha on the floor. But instead of begging for help, Dasha begins to make fun of her husband, whom she stabbed in the throat. Seeing this, Eve tries to kill her by climbing on her chest but decides to flee the scene when she hears the sound of a police siren. As Villanelle and Constantine try to escape from the country by train, Constantine experiences a heart attack and falls unconscious. So, Villanelle steals his money and escapes alone. Fortunately, Eve arrives at the station and finds Constantine unconscious, so she calls the ambulance. When the train starts moving, she tries to chase after it, but Villanelle sees her from inside and waves goodbye to her. Meanwhile, Constantine regains consciousness in the hospital, but is shocked to find Dasha in the bed next to him. After a few days, Villanelle meets up with Carolyn and requests to work for the military intelligence, but Carolyn turns down the requests, believing that she doesn't have anything to offer to the military intelligence. Meanwhile, Constantine discharges himself from the hospital without the doctor's permission. Then, he goes to meet Dasha. And as they argue over Villanelle's stubbornness, Dasha experiences a heart attack, causing her to die on the hospital bed. A few days later, Villanelle invites Eve to a dance at a restaurant. As they dance together, Villanelle cites a colleague who's also an assassin, so she secretly gives Eve a note and tells her to pick up a package from the location on the note. The assassin approaches Villanelle and informs her that a higher-up wants to speak with her. On their way to meet the higher-up, they get into an argument with the assassin, calling Villanelle a little sheep. Seeing this, she beats and pushes the assassin into the trail, causing the train to smash her to death. Meanwhile, Eve follows Villanelle's order and goes to pick up a delivery from a storage house. It turns out that the package is actually a barcode that opens a secret money-safe box that Constantine had kept as an insurance for himself. As she leaves the storage unit, Constantine runs into her and requests to take the package, but she refuses. At the same time, Carolyn meets up with Kenny's co-workers, and they show her CCTV footage showing that on the day Kenny was pushed off the roof, Constantine had actually visited and called him out for a discussion. While this is happening, Constantine and Eve are having a back-and-forth argument about the package. Suddenly, Constantine receives a call from an officer from the military intelligence, telling him to show up at the house immediately. Eve volunteers to join him since he keeps experiencing episodes of heart attacks. Unknown to them, Carolyn was holding the officer at gunpoint and had forced him to put a call across to them. Constantine and Eve arrive at the house to find out that Carolyn is holding the officer captive. It turns out that this officer had actually been working undercover for the 12 organization, with Constantine being his handler. As they uncover this, Villanelle also arrives at the house to find Eve. But seeing the situation, she takes a seat to watch how the situation unfolds. Constantine begins to confess how he had been working undercover for the 12 organization while also doubling as an informant for military intelligence. He also drops a shocking revelation that the officer is actually a high member of the 12 organization. When Carolyn asks if he had killed her son, Constantine reveals that he had invited Kenny to the rooftop to persuade him to stop investigating the 12 organization, but the boy got scared and fell off the building on his own. Carolyn doesn't believe this and points the gun to his head to shoot him. He begins to plead for help, but she ignores his cries and suddenly shoots the officer. As everyone is shocked at this, Carolyn tells Constantine to leave before she changes her mind and kills him. As soon as Constantine leaves, Eve flares up in anger and yells at Carolyn for sparing Constantine's life. Hearing this, Carolyn admits defeat and claims she no longer wants to investigate the 12. She advises Eve to give up on the investigation, so Eve angrily leaves, but Villanelle chases after her. They get to a bridge where Villanelle confesses that she no longer wants to live as an assassin. After having a deep discussion about each other's life, they both agree to walk away and never see each other again. But after walking a distance, they turn around to stare at each other. A few years later, Constantine, who's now a major in a small town in Russia, is suddenly visited by Eve, who holds him at gunpoint and forces him to give her the name of a high-ranking member of the organization named Helene. After getting the name, she leaves to continue her investigation into the organization. Meanwhile, Villanelle goes on a self-healing journey by giving her to Christ and dedicating herself to his service. Eve joins a private security company and spends her days protecting important personnel and secretly collecting evidence against the 12 organization. As for Carolyn, she's demoted from her office in military intelligence as punishment for killing an officer. But this doesn't stop her from continuing her secret investigations on the 12 organization. One day, Carolyn suddenly visits Eve and tells her there has been a series of unsolved murders and that she suspects that the victims were previous members of the 12 organization. She suspects that someone is killing the members of the organization, so she tries to persuade Eve to join her in investigating this. Eve initially hesitates but decides to join in the investigation. Meanwhile, Villanelle forces the church into baptizing her as a sign of her total repentance from sin. Afterwards, she goes to visit Eve and claims she's now a changed person. But Eve refuses to believe this and even slaps her in an attempt to make her leave. So she leaves and returns to living in the church. Eve, on the other hand, continues her investigation on Helene, the woman who can lead her uncovering the truth about the organization. She puts on a disguise and manages to slip a tracker into Helene's purse. With this tracker, Eve's coworker is able to find out that Helene resides in Paris, so they plan to visit Paris and personally meet her for questioning. But before making the trip, she goes to seek advice from her therapist on how to approach someone as evil as Helene. The therapist advises her to follow a direct confrontation, so she thanks him and leaves. As soon as she arrives in Paris, she goes to knock on Elaine's door, but the woman opens the door as if expecting her and shows off the tracker they had slipped into her bag. It turns out that Helene knows she was being tracked. Seeing this, Eve invites herself into the house and tries to act normal, but Helene presses her hands to a panel heater to torture her into confessing her reason for the tracker. Eve reveals that some members of the 12 organization had been mysteriously murdered and that she wants to get to the root of the murders. Hearing this, Helene admits that although she works for the 12, she also wants to destroy the organization, but she refuses to reveal more details, so Eve leaves her apartment. Meanwhile, Villanelle has had enough of living the Christian lifestyle, so she kills her pastor and his daughter after overhearing them gossiping about her. That same day, she locates Eve's hotel room and sneaks into it to take a rest. Eve returns from Paris and finds her in it. However, she doesn't show any reaction. Instead, she changes into a new dress and tells Villanelle to leave before she returns from work. Then, Eve goes to her workplace and instructs her coworker to track Helene's car movement history. As he runs the car number in his database, Eve tells him that she suspects that Helene is behind all the recent murders of the 12 members. She also theorizes that Helene doesn't know the leader of the organization, so she's killing them one by one until she discovers the leader. After voicing out her theory, the coworker pulls out Helene's car history, so they discover that Helene's car had been often sighted in a parking garage, so Eve goes to investigate. Meanwhile, Villanelle visits Eve's therapist and holds him captive to seek therapy from him. At the same time, Eve tracks down Helene's car to the garage and coincidentally sees Helene's girlfriend having a meltdown over a breakup with Helene. Seeing this, Eve pretends to be going through a breakup and deceives the girlfriend into going out for drinks with her to bond over their breakup experience. The unsuspecting woman agrees to this, and as they share their breakup experience during drinks, the woman unknowingly reveals that she was married to a German man named Lars, but decided to have a fling with Helene. After getting this information, Eve leaves and goes to tell her coworker about her suspicion. She suspects that Helene had approached the woman in order to get closer to the German man who may be a member of the 12 organization. Later that day, Eve returns to her hotel room to find out that Villanelle had used her iPad to communicate with the therapist. She immediately pieces together that Villanelle is holding the therapist captive, so she goes to the therapist's house and convinces Villanelle to free the man. As they sit for a discussion, Eve reveals she had called the police while coming. The police barge in and arrest Villanelle, so Eve returns to her apartment and focuses on finding the German man named Lars, whom Helene is trying to kill. After spending some days in prison, Villanelle requests a phone call. The next day, Helene shows up to visit her and convinces her to return to working as an assassin for the organization. As soon as she agrees to this, Helene releases her from prison and gives her an assassination job to carry out in Cuba. Coincidentally, Carolyn arrives in Cuba to interrogate an unconscious man who she suspects is a member of the 12 organization. Carolyn tries to question him about the organization, but he insults her and refuses to divulge any information. As she goes outside to contemplate her next course of action, someone suddenly kidnaps her. This person turns out to be Villanelle. She takes Carolyn to a lonely area and plans on killing her, but Carolyn suddenly reveals that she had known Villanelle since she was a child. Upon hearing this, Villanelle decides to spare her life. As they sit for a discussion, Carolyn convinces her to interrogate and assassinate the man who was a member of the organization. Villanelle agrees to this and tortures the man to get the names of other members of the organization, but the man tells her he doesn't know the names of other members. However, he gives her a location, so she kills him afterwards. The next day, she goes with Carolyn to visit the location. There, they meet Lars, the German man. But as soon as he sees them, he begins to run. Villanelle tries to chase after him, but he manages to escape. It turns out that in 1979, Carolyn, Constantine, Lars, and a few other people were members of a revolutionary group. When Lars requested to name their group, a young Carolyn suggested that they name it after the number of people in the group. So Lars decided to name the group 12. Carolyn had been dating Lars but became interested in Constantine. One day, while having a chat with Constantine by the lake, Lars suddenly shows up and accuses Carolyn of cheating on him. As he fights with Constantine, Carolyn intervenes and pushes him into the lake. So everyone assumed he was dead. It turns out he survived and was now a member of the 12. Meanwhile, Eve learns that Helene has released Villanelle from prison, so she kidnaps Helene's daughter from her school as some form of revenge. Later that day, a worried Helene traces her location and takes back the daughter. But the next day, she shows up again and invites Eve to go on a trip with her. When they arrive in a city, Helene instructs her to stare at a particular door for a surprise. So as she watches the door, Villanelle suddenly walks out of it. Eve begins to grow suspicious of Helene's intention, and as she watches in suspense, an arrow suddenly strikes Villanelle. Seeing this, Eve runs to her rescue. She takes her to Constantine, and with the help of Pam, a new assassin, they're able to save Villanelle's life. While this is happening, Carolyn traces Lars to his cabin and questions him about the 12, but he refuses to divulge any information. So, she makes a deal with him and promises to give out the name of the person who wants him dead in exchange for information on the person who ordered her son's death. Meanwhile, Villanelle recovers from her injury and gets away from Eve. While contemplating her next move, she's approached by Gunn, a veteran assassin. Gunn slips her a note, and when she takes a look at it, she discovers it states that Helene had hired Gunn to kill her. The note also contains Helene's hotel room number. Seeing this, Villanelle immediately calls Eve and informs her that both Carolyn and Helene are looking for Lars in Berlin City. So Eve travels to Berlin to track them down. But she finds Helene first, so she follows her to a hotel. Unknown to them, Villanelle has hidden underneath the hotel bed in order to kill the unsuspecting Helene. As Helene sits on the bed, Villanelle slits her leg and kills her in the presence of Eve before leaving. After this, Eve continues her search for Carolyn, which leads her to a cabin where Lars is also staying. Fortunately, Carolyn finds her in the woods and instructs her to leave in order not to ruin her plan of extracting information from Lars. Eve agrees to this and leaves. So Carolyn returns to the cabin and tries to beg Lars to give her the names of the 12 members. As Lars is about to reveal the names, Eve suddenly storms in and shoots him to death. After Eve leaves, Carolyn searches the dead man's body and finds a notebook containing important information on the location of the 12 members. Meanwhile, Villanelle goes to look for Gunn on a remote island and begs to live together with her. After a few days, Eve receives a cryptic text message on Helene's phone, which she had stolen after Helene died. Unable to decode the text message, she goes to seek help from Constantine. After looking at the cryptic text, he immediately deduces it's a message calling for a meeting of members. However, he doesn't know the meeting location, so he tells her to find Villanelle for help. As soon as she leaves his house, Pam, the newest assassin, walks in and kills Constantine. It turns out that Helene had given this order before her death. Meanwhile, Villanelle and Gunn get into an argument after Gunn insists on working for the 12 organization. Villanelle decides to leave the island, and as she runs away, Gunn chases after her with a matchet. At the same time, Eve arrives on the island to search for Villanelle, but she runs into an angry Gunn. So, the both of them get into a fight. During the struggle, Eve manages to blind Gunn. Afterwards, she tells Villanelle about the secret meeting involving members of the 12 organization, so Villanelle agrees to infiltrate the meetings and kill the members. At the same time, Carolyn gets wind of the secret meeting after reading the notebook she had found on Lars, so she also prepares to attend it. On D-Day, Eve and Villanelle arrive at the meeting location only to find Carolyn there. As they discuss together, Eve receives a text on Helene's phone informing them that the meeting location has been changed, so she leaves with Villanelle to the new location, which turns out to be on a boat, where a wedding ceremony is taking place. As soon as they infiltrate the boat, Villanelle instructs Eve to distract the wedding guests while she finds and kills all the members of the 12 organization. So, Eve pretends to be a priest to distract the wedding guests. Villanelle finds the meeting location and murders all the members of the organization. After killing all of them, she calls Eve out of the boat to celebrate their victory. As they share a hug, someone suddenly shoots Villanelle and continues to fire several rounds at them. Seeing this, Villanelle pushes Eve into the waters, and as they attempt to swim to safety, the mysterious assassin fires several times at Villanelle, leading to her death. Eve tries to save her, but she sinks to her death. Meanwhile, Carolyn watches this from the shore, and after making sure that Villanelle is dead, she uses a walkie-talkie to congratulate the mysterious assassin on a job well done.